The camera shook. The footage was grainy, recorded on a cheap phone, and the audio crackled with the hiss of moisture. But even through the poor quality, what it captured was impossible to ignore. Between the dripping vines and the dense, shadowy undergrowth, something moved. Something that shouldn't be there. The man holding the phone whispered, his voice choked with fear. "He's here, my God, he's here again." The focus wavered between the darkness, and then there he was, standing motionless in the murky water, as still as a forgotten statue. The clown. His tattered, moldy clothes clung to his body, far too thin, almost skeletal. His makeup was cracked, as if it had been applied decades ago and never washed away. His eyes were hollow voids, empty, soulless. He didn't move. He didn't have to. His mere presence was wrong. Behind the camera, the man began to sob softly. His breath came in quick, uneven gasps. He knew he shouldn't be there. He knew he should run, but he couldn't move. Then, without warning, the clown smiled. Not a normal smile, not a human expression. His mouth stretched too far, tearing open until it nearly reached his ears. The recording cut off with a scream, followed by frantic footsteps and the sound of something massive shifting in the water. The next morning, the video landed in the inbox of Marla Whitmore, an investigative journalist at the local newspaper. Subject: sighted again. He never left. What started as a simple urban legend was about to become a real nightmare. In the quiet town of Bellefontaine, a place where time seemed to move slower, the swamps were as old as the townspeople's deepest fears. Fog crept along the dirt roads, and after dark, certain things were best left unspoken. It was on one of those stifling days that Marla Whitmore arrived. The video was still fresh in her mind as she pulled up in front of the only decent hotel in town. She wasn't the type to scare easily, but there was something about that footage that unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. Inside, the receptionist, a thin, graying man named Earl, gave her a wary look. "You're not from around here, journalist." "I'm here to investigate a case." Earl's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Slowly, he lifted his gaze. The clown case? A heavy silence settled between them. Marla crossed her arms, keeping her expression steady. "Yes." Earl let out a weary sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "You should leave while you still can." She forced a smile. "I'll keep that in mind. Now, can you tell me where I can find Jonas Harlow?" The name made Earl's brow crease. "Joey? He doesn't like talking about it. But he's seen it. I need to hear what he knows." Earl hesitated, then scribbled an address on a napkin. "If he tells you to leave, don't push it. And..." His voice dropped to a whisper. "If you hear laughter in the swamp at night, don't look back." Marla took the napkin and walked out, but his warning clung to her mind like poison. The road leading to Jonas Harlow's house was a forgotten scar cutting through the dense green of the swamp. Marla's GPS had given up minutes after she left Bellefontaine Center, leaving her with nothing but the narrow, winding path that seemed ready to swallow her car whole with every turn. The thick humidity clung to her skin, like the air itself whispering a warning. She pulled up in front of a 2-story wooden shack, its fence collapsing and windows boarded shut. The house looked as if it had been ripped from another time, a place where the years refused to move forward. Stepping out of the car, Marla felt the weight of silence pressing in around her. The only sounds were the restless sway of trees in the wind and the ceaseless drone of insects. She walked up to the door, hesitated for a moment, then knocked 3 times. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. Just as she was about to give up, the door swung open abruptly, revealing a man whose face was etched with time and exhaustion. Joey. Harlow's deep, hollow eyes fixed on her, assessing whether she was real or just another ghost from his past. "I don't do interviews," he said, his voice rough, edged with something sharp. "I'm not here for an interview," Marla replied, steady. "I want to know about the clown." Joey's expression twisted into something between disdain and fear. "He's not a clown." Marla arched a brow. "Then what is he?" Joey glanced past her, toward the empty road shrouded in mist. He took a slow, deep breath, as if gathering the strength for something he knew he shouldn't say. "Come in." Marla stepped inside, and immediately the air seemed to shift. The house was dark, heavy, as if poisoned by the weight of terrible memories. Stacks of old newspapers covered the furniture, empty whiskey bottles littered the floor, and on the walls, taped clippings and photographs told a story no one wanted to remember. Black and white photos of missing children. Newspaper headlines screaming about bodies found under impossible circumstances. And at the center of it all, a child's drawing faded and scribbled in worn crayons, a clown with hollow eyes and a grin stretched too wide. A shiver crawled up Marla's spine. "You've seen him?" she asked. Joey let out a hollow laugh, void of humor. "I've seen him, and I've seen what he does." He grabbed a cigarette from the counter, lighting it with trembling fingers. "You think you're here to investigate a legend? Something? To turn into a story for clicks?" He exhaled smoke, his gaze distant. "Let me tell you something. Some stories are just stories. But this one's a warning." A tight knot formed in Marla's stomach. "Tell me what happened." Joey took another drag, eyes locked on something only he could see in the past. "I was a cop here 20 years ago. Strangest case of my career was in 2004. 4 teenagers went missing after daring each other to go into the swamp at night. 3 bodies were found days later. The 4th kid was never recovered." He paused, crushing his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray. Every body had its mouth torn into a grin, like someone had grabbed their lips and stretched until the skin split, but there were no signs of struggle, no footprints, no wounds. Marla's stomach churned. "And the 4th boy?" Joey stared at her for a long time before answering. "He came back." "Came back? What do you mean?" Joey ran a hand over his face, visibly unsettled. "A month after the funerals, his mother woke up in the middle of the night and found him standing in the hallway, staring at her. Covered in mud, eyes dull like a broken doll. He didn't say a word. He just smiled." A chill ran through Marla's veins. "What happened to him?" Joey picked up an old photograph and tossed it onto the table in front of her. It was grainy, taken with an aging camera, a thin boy, his stare vacant, his mouth stretched open too wide for a human smile. "He grew up," Joey whispered. "And now, when the mist covers the swamp, he appears." The silence that followed was suffocating. Marla looked at the picture, then back at Joey. "You're telling me the clown isn't a man in a costume?" Joey cut in. "He's something wearing the shape of a clown, something that shouldn't exist." Marla's stomach twisted. "How do I find him?" Joey let out a humorless laugh. "You don't need to find him if you stay here. He'll find you." The light in the room flickered, and for a fraction of a second the silence broke. A laugh. Faint. Distant. Marla turned sharply toward the door, but outside there was only the swamp's endless darkness. When she looked back at Joey, his face had drained of all color. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her heart pounding. Joey didn't respond right away. He just stood there, breathing fast, before finally whispering, "It's too late now." Joey's door was locked, but that didn't stop Marla from feeling like something outside knew exactly where she was. The silence in the room was suffocating. Joey said nothing, just stared at the wall, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. "He found me once," he murmured, "and he never left me alone." Marla held the photo of the missing boy. His face felt familiar, not because she knew him, but in a way that ran deeper, something primal, instinctive. There was something in the child's empty gaze that triggered an ancient, irrational fear, as if she were looking at something that should never have existed. She tore her eyes away from the photo and looked at Joey. "I need to see him with my own eyes." Joey let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think you have a choice?" A chill ran down Marla's spine. "What do you mean?" He stubbed out his cigarette, his expression hardening. "He's seen you. That means now you'll see him too." Marla shivered. "That doesn't make sense." Joey leaned forward, elbows on the table, rubbing his face with both hands. He looked drained, like carrying this weight had hollowed him out over the years. "The swamp belongs to him. So does this town. Everyone here knows, but no one speaks. No one looks. Because if you look too long, he looks back." Marla thought about the video she received, that unnatural stretched grin, the eyes two empty black voids. What does he want? Joey hesitated. Company. Before Marla could respond, the light flickered, a brief glitch, a momentary failure in the power. But in that split second of darkness, she felt it. Something was there. She turned instinctively toward the window. Outside, between the tree trunks, within the swamp's shifting shadows, something was watching. Tall, pale figure, still, unmoving. The clown. Marla's breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to shrink. Every muscle in her body tensed. She blinked. He was gone. Marla stepped back, heart hammering in her chest. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Joey didn't answer, but his face said everything. Yes, he had seen it too. A lump formed in Marla's throat. This was what Joey meant. It wasn't a choice. Now that the clown had seen her, he would never leave. No escape tonight. The motel was small and crumbling, a wooden building that looked like it had been put together by unsteady hands and left to rot in the swamp's humidity. Marla stepped into her rented room, locked the door, and held her breath for a moment. She checked her watch. 12:37 a.m. What was happening to her? Why did this presence cling to her thoughts like a thick, sticky shadow? She collapsed onto the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence was so deep it was almost a sound in itself, a muffled hum, like a whisper from something that shouldn't be there. Her gaze drifted to the window. The fog outside had thickened, swallowing the road, the trees, everything. Then the laughter came, faint, distant, but unmistakable, the laughter of something that shouldn't exist. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Sweat rolled down the back of Marla's neck. "Don't look." But it was already too late. Her eyes moved on their own, drawn by some primitive instinct to seek out the threat, and there, in the middle of the road, standing in the mist. He was there. The clown didn't move, he just watched. Even from a distance, Marla could feel it. The emptiness of his stare, that grotesque, torn grin, like his own skin was trying to escape his face. She blinked. He was closer. Marla froze. She hadn't heard footsteps, no sound of movement. But now he was only a few feet from the window, his head tilted, his eyes too wide, his smile stretching. Marla held her breath. If she blinked again, bam! A noise from the bathroom. Something had fallen. She spun around, heart pounding. What the hell was that? She forced herself to breathe, stay calm, but when she turned back to the window, he was gone. The room seemed darker, and then, in the bathroom mirror, the reflection changed. Marla was still there, pale, shaking, but behind her, something else, a tall shadow, hollow eyes, and a mouth, stretching into a smile that wasn't human. Marla screamed, and the light shattered, plunging the room into total darkness. The motel room was swallowed in darkness. Shattered glass from the broken light bulb scattered across the floor. The silence was so deep that Marla could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She kept staring at the mirror, but the mirror wasn't looking back the way it should. Her reflection was there, but it wasn't her. The shadow behind her was no longer just a shadow. It had a face now, eyes, completely hollow, a mouth stretched too wide, its grin pulled back as if unseen hands were tearing at the flesh. And then, slowly, the reflection smiled. Marla didn't. Her body locked up. Fear took hold of every muscle, making it impossible to move. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The reflection stepped forward. She hadn't moved. But in the mirror, her other self was closer now. The mouth stretched open, wider and wider, beyond human limits. And then, Marla. The voice wasn't coming from the mirror. It was inside her head. A soft whisper, cold and sticky, slithering through her mind. She screamed, and the mirror shattered. Glass exploded across the room. She stumbled back, falling hard onto the floor. For a moment, the only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then, something moved inside the broken mirror. The shards reflected something that should not have been there. Teeth, a scattered, incomplete grin. The light flickered back on. Marla blinked rapidly, her skin damp with cold sweat. The mirror was destroyed, but there was nothing there anymore. Nothing. Just the night outside. But she knew. He was close, and he wasn't going to stop. A false sense of safety dawn arrived, bringing an illusion of safety. Marla grabbed her camera. If the clown had already found her, there was no turning back. The only choice left was to see this through. She drove to the swamp. The place was smothered in morning fog, the black, stagnant water reflecting twisted trees. Insects buzzed thick in the air, and the stench of decay clung to everything. She followed a dirt path. Joey had told her the last bodies had been found near an abandoned dock. She reached it. The dock was a skeleton of rotting wood, creaking under its own weight. The sound of the water was quiet, too quiet, like something was breathing beneath it. Marla turned on her camera. The screen trembled slightly in her hands. She swallowed hard. The wind sliced through the swamp like a whisper. And then she saw it, floating in the water. At first it looked like a mannequin. The skin was strange, too pale, too still. But then its eyes opened. Marla barely swallowed a scream. The body was yanked under the surface. Gone. Silence. Then, bam! Something slammed into the wood beneath her feet. She stumbled back, nearly falling. Bam! 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 Something was under the dock. Marla crouched, peering through the cracks. The darkness below was thick, impossible to see through the mud. And then, two eyes opened in the blackness. Too large, too close. Her heart nearly stopped. The water bubbled. She bolted upright and ran. Her feet sank into the mud, but she didn't stop. The sound of something crawling behind her made her stomach lurch. She reached her car, threw herself inside, and slammed the door, locking it with shaking hands. Her breath came in frantic gasps. She looked at the road. No one. Then, tap, tap, tap. Something tapped against the window. Slowly she turned her head, and there he was, so close she could see every cracked line in his skin. The clown didn't move. He just stared and smiled, but the smile was different now. Too many teeth, rotting gums. His mouth was still stretching, wider and wider and wider, and then he spoke, not out loud, not with sound, but inside her mind. You already know my name, Marla. The scream caught in her throat. The world tilted, and then he was gone. The glass was smeared with mud, but in the middle of the grime, a single word had been traced by a thin, bony finger. Company. Marla slammed her foot on the gas and sped away. But deep down she already knew there was nowhere left to run. The car roared down the empty road, the speedometer climbing far past what was safe on the slick, muddy trail. But Marla didn't care. She just needed to get out. The fog thickened, almost solid. The world around her blurred into a twisting mass of trees and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Fear pounded in her throat. She glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing but... Why did she still feel like she was being watched? Her grip on the wheel tightened. She forced herself to breathe. You already know my name, Marla. The whisper still echoed inside her head. Not just a memory, it was still there, inside her. She turned her head and nearly lost control of the car. For a split second, just long enough to see, he was sitting in the passenger seat. Wet, rotting skin, hollow, pupilless eyes, and that impossible, shredded grin, stretching so far it nearly split his face in two. Marla screamed and jerked the wheel. The car skidded on the mud. The back end fishtailed violently, like something had reached up and grabbed hold of it. She fought for control, slammed the brakes. The tires lost grip. The car spun off the road, and then everything went black, the room with no door. The first thing Marla noticed when she woke up was the sound, a slow, steady drip, drip, drip. She blinked. She wasn't on the road anymore. She was lying on a bed. But this wasn't the motel. The walls were the wrong kind of white, not dirty but worn, as if they had been painted over 1,000 times to cover something up. And that sound, drip, drip, drip. She turned her head. In the corner, an old rusted sink leaked into a chipped basin. But the water, it wasn't clear, it was red. Marla's heart stammered in her chest. She scrambled up, backing against the wall. Drip, drip, drip. The blood kept falling, trickling down the drain, vanishing into whatever waited below. No, this is a dream. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to tell herself none of this was real. Then the door creaked open. Slowly, a long, dragging scrape of wood against the floor. The hallway outside was dark. No light at all, but Marla felt something standing there, watching her from the other side of the blackness. And then the laughter came, low, wet, getting closer. Marla shrank back into the room. The floor was freezing beneath her bare feet. She didn't remember taking off her shoes. This isn't real. This isn't real. But then something crawled out of the dark. Pale hands, slick with mud, dragged themselves across the floor, clawing forward as if pulling something impossibly heavy. Then came the head, the face, the smile. Marla screamed. She lunged for the door, slammed it shut, and pressed her weight against it. Bam, bam, bam. Something pounded from the other side. This wasn't a nightmare. This was real. The laughter came again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the room, behind her. Marla turned slowly. The cracked mirror above the sink still reflected the room. But it didn't reflect her. Something else stood in her place. Tall, pale, its smile stretching into forever, and then the reflection blinked. Darkness swallowed her whole. The secret beneath the swamp. Marla woke up screaming, but she was back. In the motel. Sunlight poured through the window, bright and warm, as if nothing had ever happened, except there were muddy footprints on the floor, and the word company was still smeared across the glass. She needed answers. Grabbing her things, she drove straight to the town library. Bellefontaine was small, but every small town had secrets it tried to bury. She combed through old archives. Something wasn't right about this place. People had been disappearing for over a century. The earliest recorded case, 1892, then 1925, 1947, 1970, 1986, 2004, the same pattern, always near the swamp. Witnesses spoke of a strange figure in the mist, but it was a 1956 article that made Marla's blood run cold. 3 children vanish after claiming they saw the smiling man. The article included a photo, and there he was, the same tattered clothes, the same pale, hollow face, the same wrong smile. But then Marla noticed something else. One of the missing boys had her last name, Whitmore. The air left her lungs, her pulse pounded in her ears. It couldn't be a coincidence. She dug deeper. She searched the name, and then she found it. The boy who disappeared in 1956, he was her grandfather. A slow, crawling horror crept over her skin. This wasn't just a town mystery. It was her mystery, her family's mystery. Her hands trembled as she slammed the book shut. And then she realized she was no longer alone. Deep in the back of the library, between the towering shelves, someone was standing there, still, watching. She didn't need to see the face. She already knew who it was. The laughter slithered through the aisles, low, soft, and getting closer. The laughter continued, low, dragged out, too human to be human. Marla stood frozen between the library shelves, her fingers digging into the wooden table in front of her. She didn't want to look, but she knew she had to. Taking a slow breath, she turned her head, and there he was, at the end of the aisle, standing in the dim light, half hidden in the shadows, tall, thin, his skin far too pale, blotched with dark, rotting bruises. His clown costume was damp, clinging to his body like he had just crawled out of the swamp. And that smile, too wide, too stretched, he didn't move. But Marla felt him, that presence slithered inside her, over her, behind her. Not just a physical being, an idea, a living concept, something that should never have existed. Then he began to move. Not walking, not running, but gliding as if his feet barely touched the floor. Marla's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But something inside her held her still. Something in her wanted to know. She took a step back and knocked over a stack of books. The noise crashed through the silence like a gunshot, and instantly the laughter stopped. The silence was worse. The air around her thickened, turning to lead in her lungs. And then he was gone. Marla blinked. Nothing was there, just the rows of books, dust floating in the air. But it wasn't relief. She knew he was still close. Now he was just waiting, and she needed to find out why. The forbidden name. Once she was sure the clown was gone, Marla returned to the research table. If her grandfather had been one of the victims, he must have known something. She flipped through more files, searching for any connection between the name Whitmore and Bellefontaine's history. Then she found it, a yellowed page from a very old journal. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like the person had been writing in fear. The thing is back. It always comes back. It has a name, but no one can say it. If you speak the name, it finds you faster. If you look at it too long, it looks back. Marla's stomach twisted. The name. There was a name, but it had been scratched out like someone had tried to erase it from existence. Only a few letters were visible, H-A-R-L. She tried to piece it together, but before she could, the library light popped, and the silence turned into something heavy and alive. She knew what that meant. He was here, and he wasn't waiting anymore. Back to the swamp. Marla didn't run. Running was useless now. She knew where she needed to go. She grabbed her camera, locked her car, and headed back to the swamp. The sun had begun to sink below the horizon by the time she reached the abandoned dock. The air stank of rot, of something dead for far too long. She gripped the camera tightly. "I know you're here." The wind howled through the trees. The swamp seemed to breathe around her. She swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" Silence. Then the water stirred, slow, deliberate. Something was rising, and then he stepped out of the swamp. The same face, the same grin. But something was different. Something was wrong with him. His bones shifted beneath his skin, as if he was changing shape, even as she watched. And then he spoke, not with sound, not with his mouth. The words bloomed inside her skull like something alive. "You already knew, Marla." A shiver ran through her body. The swamp seemed to close in around her. Time felt wrong, the sun sinking too fast. The air grew thick, crushing her chest like invisible hands. And then his grin widened. "You came to me just like your grandfather did." Marla's stomach twisted. What happened to him?" The clown took a step closer. The swamp water parted around his feet as if he wasn't sinking at all. He wanted answers too. The words clawed at her mind, but he understood too late. Marla's eyes burned. His presence was suffocating. "What are you?" she whispered. The laughter came this time, loud, exploding inside her head. "I am what you let in." The swamp shook. Marla fell to her knees, her hands trembling. The shadows moved, and then she saw, behind the clown, deep in the swamp, rising from the black water, there were more. Grinning faces floating just beneath the surface. Waiting for her. The world unraveled, time crumbled, and Marla finally understood. She had never had a choice. The clown had always been waiting, and now she would join him forever. The water parted around the clown's feet, and they began to emerge. 1, 2, 3. Dozens of grinning mouths tore through the dark surface, stretched too wide, teeth lined like blades in a wound that never healed. Marla couldn't move. Time was broken, warping in strange pulses, the world folding in on itself, and then came the sound. Not laughter, not this time, a chorus of voices whispering directly into her mind. "You've been here before, Marla." A chill crawled down her spine. The clown took another step forward. The water didn't react to him. What do you want from me?" Her voice barely felt like her own anymore. The grin stretched wider. "The same thing I've always wanted. Company." The smiles in the water began to shift, circling around her. And that's when she saw the eyes. They didn't belong to the clown, they belonged to them. The missing children, the lost teenagers, the adults who never came back. They were still here, trapped inside it, swallowed by its endless hunger. She wanted to scream, but the clown was already too close. His face hovered just inches from hers. The stench of rotting mud and decayed flesh filled her lungs. Eyes black as an abyss stared through her, and then he whispered, "You still don't understand, Marla." She didn't want to understand. She already knew. You never had a choice. You've always been mine. His arms opened wide, and Marla fell into the darkness. The cycle repeats, silence, nothing. Marla opened her eyes. She was back in the motel. The clock on the nightstand read 12:37 a.m. The exact time as the night before. The window glass was clean, no muddy fingerprints. The room was spotless, no sign of the nightmare. She sat up, heart pounding against her ribs. A dream. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, as if the world itself was watching her. She raised a hand to her face and felt something cold and sticky on her skin. Her fingers trembled as she brought them to her lips, and then she tasted it. Mud, thick, black, rotten, straight from the swamp. And then the laughter came. Low, choked, but not from outside. This time it came from inside her. She turned slowly toward the mirror. Her reflection didn't smile back. Her reflection was crying. But Marla wasn't, because her mouth wouldn't stop smiling. 2 months later, a new video surfaced online. The footage was shaky, the audio crackled. The screen showed the thick swamp fog, swallowing the twisted trees. And then a figure appeared, tall, thin, skin pale and wet, face streaked with mud and cracks, as if she had just crawled up from the water's depths. Eyes hollow, and the smile the same as always, but this time it wasn't the clown, it was Marla. Sighted again. The swamp clown is back. You've heard this story before, but you ignored it. Thought it was just another urban legend. Now, Marla Whitmore is missing. And her last video, it's real. The clown is not a man in a costume. He is not just another ghost. He waits. He watches. He chooses. And once he sees you, he never lets you go. Warning. If you've watched the video, he already knows you exist. If you've heard his name, he's already on his way. If you've dreamed about him, it's too late. They say he needs company. And now he's waiting for you. Tag a friend who would dare step into this swamp. Share before they take this post down. But be careful, because when the next fog rolls in, you might be the next one sighted. Do you dare to look at him? Comment, "I see the clown."